a very difficult truth that many of us come to when we're healing in the healing process from relational trauma is that we subconsciously chose careers, professions, work environments, supervisors, managers that very much mirror the homes that we grew up in and the attachment figures that we had. And it's important to note that this is a deeply subconscious process. At the point that many of us are choosing careers, we're choosing colleges, we are, choosing our first workplaces, we are unaware that we have this relational trauma, okay? So all of this is a deeply subconscious process, but we are choosing these places of employment, we are choosing these bosses, we are choosing these professions because they very much feel familiar to us, okay? And so what I mean is if we grew up in a home where there was a lot of chaos and a lot of instability, and it was a pressure cooker and it was crisis after crisis, or we had an attachment figure that was incredibly hot and cold, or they would withdraw their love and affection, or they would only come towards us when we did something or we accomplished something, then we are going to seek out people and places like this in our adulthood, as long as we are unaware of our relational trauma, okay? And so what happens when we enter into the healing process, and it's important to note that a lot of times our jobs and job burnout and really stressful work relationships can be that thing that lead us into therapy, and then we start to understand what's happening with our relational trauma. But what happens is as we start to understand that we have relational trauma and we start to do that connection with our bodies again, we start to learn how to reconnect with our physical bodies, and we start to pay attention to our emotions and we come alive, is that these places of employment and these supervisors that we work with that mirrored our attachment figures starts to become really uncomfortable. There is a very deep sense of discomfort in being in these environments and around these people, okay? And so it's important to recognize that if we're noticing this, okay, and if we're paying attention to it, that is a sign of healing. And I know that can be a deeply uncomfortable space to be in, all right? And so what happens is we start to understand that we were subconsciously drawn to these work environments, these careers, these managers, and it can kind of throw us into a bit of a crisis because, naturally we're going to say to ourselves, oh my gosh, I did this. I wasn't aware. I was in a trance essentially when I chose this career, this profession, these people that I'm working with. I need to get out. I need to get out. And I understand that, totally understand that. And we hold space for that in therapy. And, we want to make sure that we're not making any abrupt decisions. Okay. This is a wonderful space to be curious. It's a wonderful, wonderful space to our opportunities to reconnect with our physical bodies, to notice what's happening in ourselves when we're around these people, when we're in these patterns. And, again, it's a lot of discernment, and it's just a lot of getting very curious. And it's a really wonderful opportunity to observe ourselves, to observe these patterns that we engage in, observe these people that we're engaging with. And, so what I will say is that, there may come a point when we have to make a decision to change our jobs, or we need to change our places of employment. But again, that's after a degree of discernment is kind of done. And that is very helpful to do that in the therapy process. And what I see a lot are folks who understand this, they come to realize this, that they chose these professions subconsciously, these people that they work with subconsciously. And what they decide to do is they decide to try to be different in their workspaces. They decide to try to pull back a little bit. They decide to not give 150% anymore. They're just going to work the 40 hours a week. They decide to just detach a little bit, okay? And maybe they will start to communicate boundaries with their supervisors and their colleagues. And what happens is we do this and then we watch and we see what our employers do, what our colleagues do. Can they accept that? Can they honor that? Or do they push back against that? Okay. Because the reality here, folks, in our healing from relational trauma is that we cannot unsee the things that we now see. We cannot unknow the truths that we now know. And so staying in a space like this, knowing what we know, is going to slowly kind of kill something inside of us. Okay. And this is where we see a lot of folks getting sick, physically sick, because we know this truth and we're ignoring it, and our bodies are going to rebel in some way, shape, or form. So I see a lot of folks trying to change, okay? And that's a wonderful thing. And we just get curious about that. Can they handle this? We'll see. Maybe they can. Wonderful. What a great corrective experience. I've communicated these boundaries. I've honored my truths, and these people heard me and they respect me and they are with me. Okay, wonderful. A lot of times employers, colleagues are not going to respect this. They're going to push back. At that point, we need to make a change. Okay, most of us need to make a change. And so what I see a lot of people do is they don't change professions necessarily, but they go in search of environments that can honor their need for a healthy balance with work and life. They are trauma informed. They really closely look at the people who would be their supervisors, and they observe the patterns in these people who would be their supervisors to see if they can be respectful, and if they don't micromanage, and if they can give a degree of trust in us and our abilities and our skills. They look and they watch to see if these people are demeaning, if they verbally abuse, if they gossip, what the culture is like in the work, right? So it's more of this kind of process where we kind of interview the people who might be our prospective employers. It's very important where we put our time and energy into when we are healing from relational trauma. Okay, so I see a lot of folks do this, and they match with environments that are much more appropriate for their healing process from relational trauma. Okay, and again, this is going to be a corrective experience, which is incredible, has a capacity to be very healing. I do see some people who make a decision to change careers. They just come to understand that they know this is not what they wanted to do. This is not what their dream was. This does not bring them happiness. This does not make them feel like they are being of service to themselves, okay? This is not in alignment with their values and their beliefs. They cannot be authentic and work in this profession. That is a beautiful thing, and that's a very difficult thing to come to. And I have so much respect for folks who come to this place, okay? And really take the time and the energy to think about this and to make that switch. And it's a beautiful way to honor ourselves in our healing process. One other point I want to bring up here is that, for many of us who grew up in homes where, this developmental trauma it was ripe for developmental trauma, we are programmed that our worth and our value comes from how much we produce, how much we accomplish, how much can we please that attachment figure, how much can we make them happy, right? What happens then in our adult lives is that this is a recipe for us to burn out very easily in our careers and our professions as adults, okay? And so we also start to understand this in the healing from relational trauma, and we start to understand there are certain people who will take advantage of that part in us that is willing to go 190% at the expense of our mental and physical well-being. There are folks who will take advantage of that. And so as we start to understand this about ourselves, like, oh my gosh, this is what I do. I try to gain love. I try to gain acceptance, from people who are like my attachment figures, from my bosses, and I burn myself out in the process. This is another one of those things that brings folks into therapy, okay? And so as we start to really honor ourselves and pay attention to our physical bodies and pay attention to our physical exhaustion and our emotional states, again, we pay attention to this and we don't ignore it. And again, we know this about ourselves, and we start to pull back and we notice our needs and we honor ourselves. And I just want to say that if you're noticing burnout, that in and of itself is a sign of healing. You're noticing it and you are acknowledging it. You are not compartmentalizing it anymore. And folks, I know it can be a really hard spot to be burned out in our careers, but I got to tell you, this is a sign of healing. It can be a wonderful thing. If you notice this is a wonderful way to get into therapy, to talk to somebody about this, okay? Thank you for being on here and being willing to grow and learn and expand. Bye.